Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you on this Friday, April 5th, here at This, That, and Theology Live. We're glad to have you here with us again. This has been kind of an interesting week as I've been kind of fitting everything together. I had some hardware failures, which meant that a lot of what I had planned to do this week didn't happen. So if you were watching last week, you know I was going to talk about cell phones this week. But with just everything going on, I realized I needed to make a change. And so I want to make sure that I gave the questions about cell phones, especially cell phones in young people. I wanted to give us plenty of time to actually study that and be able to have a good conversation. And so with that in mind, we're going to move that off until next week. And this week, we're going to be talking about movies. Specifically, we're going to be talking about movies that are based on true stories, based on true events, not necessarily completely accurate, but definitely sort of based on true events. But with that in mind, as you're leaving comments right there as we're gathering together, just a question: how much time do you spend, or do you think you spend, on your phone each week? It's one of those kind of things where we don't really want to think about that. If you have an iPhone, I know it'll actually tell you how long your screen is on, which can be a little deceptive sometimes. I know I'll often have music or a video playing in the background while I'm doing something else, but we are constantly inundated with stuff, with data, with stuff on our cell phones, with stuff on our streaming platforms, whatever it is that we're doing. It's everywhere. And so how much time do you think you're spending on your phone? And maybe you want to check and say, okay, well, how much time am I actually spending on my phone? Go ahead and leave that in the comments if you dare. I know some of us aren't exactly excited about how much time we spend in front of the screen, but as we look at next week, looking and seeing, kind of answering some questions about some of the implications they have in using cell phones, how that actually rewires our brains, how we're actually prone to become addicted to it. We'll do all of that coming up next week as we talk about cell phones. This week, of course, we are talking about true-ish movies that inspire us. We'll also take a look at the Bible reading as you're doing the 1 year through the Bible. We are doing the 1 year Bible online plan. So if you're not necessarily using that one, you may note that there's some discrepancy between what you're reading and what I'm talking about. But if you have been doing this plan, we'll talk about today we're going to be talking about Deuteronomy. So I'm looking forward to that. We'll go ahead and get started in about a minute. Again, the question for today is, how much time do you think you're spending on your cell phone? Some of you may be on your phone right now as you're watching. So that's probably part of the question. If you are joining us after the fact, I mean, we are streaming each Friday live at 10 a.m. But if you're watching afterwards, thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of the This, That, and Theology community. It is a growing community. We just passed 100 subscribers, which is really exciting as we're looking at how we see how theology interacts with the world around us. The quote that we often use at the beginning of our movie reviews is that here at This, That, and Theology, we're helping you see your worldview and the worldview around you. It's kind of a two things combined. Well, if you have been doing that Bible, we'll go ahead and get started. If you have been doing the 1 year through the Bible on oneyearbibleonline.com, these are the passages that you have been reading throughout the week. We're in Deuteronomy chapters 11 through 27, right? That middle section right there in that last book of the Pentateuch. And in the New Testament, you're in Luke chapters 8 through 11. So this is, as my brain is a little fuzzy, but I'm pretty sure this is the third gospel that we're reading through, chapters 8 through 11. There's some difficult passages in Luke in this reading section. I'm sure you made through it just fine. We've been reading Psalm 70 through 76, and we are still in Proverbs 12 for this week. But today we are going to talk about Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy is the fifth book, the last book in the Torah, which is often considered the books of the law. And throughout the first five books, as we've been reading through Scripture this year, you'll see that while, yes, it's all about the law, there's also a lot of story about God's people, all the way from creation into entering the promised land. And here at the end of Deuteronomy, what we get is we do see this final challenge for God's people as they're getting ready to go into the promised land. But Deuteronomy can be a little daunting because there is a lot of law. In fact, a lot of the passages that many people in culture today will quote as being outmoded or simply just not a part of what modern contemporary culture would look like are coming from books like Deuteronomy. So, what do we do? How do we approach that? As we're understanding that, as Second Timothy 3, 4, 15, and 16 and 17 say, all of Scripture is useful. How do we approach that with this kind of dense and sometimes a little repetitive book? Well, Deuteronomy can be broken up into three different parts. The first part is kind of an introduction. There's a speech where Moses is calling God's people to gather, to listen to the word, to see what's going on. And in that, we have the Shema, which is in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. And this is a really important passage in Scripture. As we look at that, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words that I command to you today shall be on your heart." And then he goes on to challenge them to pass this on. You teach this diligently to your children while you're sitting in your house, when you're walking on the way, when you lie down, when you rise. It'll be a part of all of your living in your culture. And so that first part is reminding God's people, even as he's about to reiterate the law, that this is something that is the core of who they are. And that's why you get in the very end, you have him looking back at these laws, all of these things. These are the last words of Moses before he passes away and Israel moves in. And there we see this combination of blessing and curses, where Moses says, if you, God through Moses tells his people, if you follow me, if you obey me, there will be great blessings. The people who support you, there'll be great blessings for them. But if you don't follow the law, there will be consequences. There will be curses as well. And then, of course, Moses also shaking his head goes, "And I know that you are going to rebel, but there's hope because you can always return." And that's where we get into the center section. And if you were reading this week, you were in that center section largely. I believe we were, as I was looking, we're on 11 through 27. So the bulk of your reading in the Old Testament this week was on this center section, where there's a restatement, a summary of the law. And as we're reading that, particularly as we're comparing it to the cultures that are around Israel at that time, because one of the problems that we have often is that in a modern context, we'll try to read these Old Testament passages like Deuteronomy, which are contrasting with the cultures around them. And we'll say, well, look at how weird those are compared to our modern law. You have to understand the original context looking at that there. Because what God is telling his people is that you are different from those who are around you. You are not just like those around you. The way you behave, the way you treat others, all of those are things that are important for us to realize that God's people are different, and we should act different. We should live differently. And so there's your structure of Deuteronomy. And if you're getting caught up in it and having difficulty with it, all of the book, in fact, all the Torah can be summed up in this. We have hearts of stone, and through Jesus, we have hearts of flesh. That even though all of these laws are difficult and we don't understand how they live in our own lives, the ultimate part of it is that our hearts are hardened, and God's law reveals that, and that through Christ, what we just celebrated on Easter just a few days ago, we know that we can have new life. We can have lives that are of flesh. So you don't need to be afraid when you're looking at Deuteronomy, when you're looking at Old Testament passages, because we look at them looking backwards through the cross, realizing that Jesus has changed our very lives and we have a new worldview. We have a different way of looking at things because of the cross. So stay up with your reading. I know that it can be difficult. We've gotten through the most difficult passages in a one-year Bible by getting through Deuteronomy. By the time we get to next week, we'll be in Joshua, which is a lot more exciting. That's the kind of the war movie version or more war movie section of the Old Testament. So it's exciting. There's lots of incredible battles. There are some dry parts that we'll see, I believe, next week, not this coming week, but the week after that. But by and large, we moved into a really exciting portion of Scripture in the Old Testament, at least. We'll continue reading through there. So I encourage you to stick with it. If you've missed a few, don't worry about it. Just keep going. It's an incredible blessing to spend time in God's Word every day. So today's topic, as we're looking at how our worldview interacts with the worldview around us, is we're talking about movies. We're talking about true-ish movies that inspire us. So if you looked at last year, just last year alone, the number of movies that we had that were based on true stories. Just a few of them were Air, which was about creating the Air Jordan sneakers. We had Gran Turismo, which was based on the story of a gamer who has become a very successful professional race car driver. Killers of the Flower Moon, which I have not seen, but it's on my list of things to see. That deals with some events that happened with oil and murders and just kind of a lot of drama that happened on Native American land. It's on my list of things I'm looking forward to seeing coming up, but it's a 3-hour film, and it's one of those just finding the time to sit down for a 3-hour film can be a challenge, even when it's something that you really enjoy. Next Goal Wins, we reviewed that here on this channel. We also reviewed Gran Turismo. Next Goal Wins is about a soccer team or a football team, if you're not in the United States, that was just absolutely terrible. And they just needed to get one goal. If they could just get one goal, they felt like they will win. It's supposed to be a very encouraging sports movie. We also reviewed this one on the channel. I was a little disappointed by it, but it was based on true events. Oppenheimer won Best Picture, I believe. It's award winning. We didn't see it here. We have a short for all the reasons why. Some of the content in there just meant that I didn't feel comfortable going in and seeing that in theaters. Boys in the Boat came out in Christmas time. That was about a bunch of rowers from the Northwest who basically broke through all the barriers of culture and their financial ability to go and win their events in the Olympics while they were being held in Berlin. Uh, Fantastic, excellent movie. Really enjoyed it. Jesus Revolution was also last year. That movie was about kind of the beginning of the Calvary Chapel movement. Excellent film. We'll talk about that one in a little bit more. Sound of Freedom was a huge movie that happened last year. Came out of nowhere, something of an independent film. A lot of people saw how it really wasn't getting promoted, and it exploded worldwide. It's incredible how much impact that film had. But these are just a sampling of all the movies that came out just last year based on true events, whether they were fully based on true events or not. They were movies that people went and saw, and the stories were at least based on reality. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about how science fiction is an essential movie genre, essential genre, not just in film but also in books. And through science fiction, as we talked about then, science fiction looks forward to what future events might be if they continue the path that we're on now. So it looks at technology, it looks at culture, it looks how we're living now, and it kind of looks to see how it would look if it continued on the same path towards the future. And so science fiction is, I said it was essential because it helps us understand where we are now by looking into where we might be. Books that are based on historical events or true-ish stories, and I always say "ish" because there's all sorts of changes that get made for entertainment to make the movies more engaging, to accelerate the plot, to make it more relatable. But the reality is that all of those films are based, at least loosely, on real events, and they are some of the best films. In fact, the more that as I've gotten older, the more films that I've seen, I've enjoyed some of those films a lot more than some of the other films just because there's a true story. There's more to the story that you can follow. And so we're looking back, especially when we're talking about culture as a whole, we can help look at those movies that have come before and see how we got where we are now. How do we get to the place that we are now? What events have brought our culture, who have brought our individual stories to the place that we are now. So if we looked at the culture around us and we're confused at how in the world we get here, this is one of the ways we can remind ourselves. It also helps us remember what has transpired in the past so that we don't repeat it. One of the films that I have on my list, I create uh, not even a long list, but a list that had a lot of films that are from the past, that talk about what has happened before. Band of Brothers, an excellent HBO series. It is definitely not for kids. It's quite violent. There's pretty significant language, but we need to be reminded of just what happened in World War II. And there's been a few films recently that have come out that have touched those. We're seeing fewer and fewer of those. And I think that that's a bad thing. Part of the reason we're seeing fewer and fewer of those is the people who actually lived through those events are many of them are no longer with us. And so there's a real danger that we'll forget what happened with World War II. We'll forget the travesties that occurred, why we need to remember. So we should be watching those. The movie that is referenced in our title slide for day is Ford versus Ferrari. I love that movie. It's probably one of my favorite films that I watched last year. I think I watched it 3 times. Great movie about the 24 Hours of Le Mans race where an American motor company wanted to beat Ferrari, who was the premier automaker, and just the journey that took them to get there. It's a great film. Really enjoy it. Definitely one of those movies you need to watch with a good amount of bass in your volume as you hear those engines roar to life as they're going. But I mean, movies like The Untouchables, which dealt with the effort to bring down Al Capone during Prohibition and looking at the way people lived, what sacrifices they made. It's also an inspiring story of the faith when you realize that probably the main person there was a believer and was really working diligently. I mean, The Crown is an incredibly popular series on Netflix, and it is based sometimes loosely, sometimes a little closer on real events. These are all things that are incredibly um, popular, something that inspire us. I mean, even just looking at a few of the films that came out this year. I mean, I mentioned Air, which is a film about creating the Air Jordan sneakers. Those very when I was in high school, everybody wanted those shoes. They were incredibly popular. But as you watch this movie, there's a part of you that's inspired because you realize just how much of an impact one person can have on an entire industry. It's about the shoes, but in a lot of ways, it's just about how one person really changed the game of basketball, and also changed the way that shoes and such were marketed. Uh, Nike was kind of a no-name shoe. They definitely weren't a shoe for basketball, and because of the influence of Michael Jordan through that his incredible basketball ability, his proficiency as an athlete. Uh, Now Michael Jordan is synonymous with basketball, and Nike is synonymous with sports shoes, and that really wasn't the case back when they were starting. Gran Turismo, we talked about it. One of my favorite movies from last year. Really exciting. Again, another car movie. But you see how one person, despite everybody telling him that he couldn't do it, breaking out of just playing video games to actually being someone who's able to compete professionally. There's a lot of details that got changed in that film to make it more interesting. A lot of characters in real life were combined, but it still ended up being an entertaining, fun film and really challenged people, especially a lot of young people who play video games all the time, to actually see that there is a possibility for life beyond video games, that they could take it there. I know that I have, as I've been playing racing games and flight simulators, part of me wants to figure out a way of getting out and actually doing those things, not just on a screen, but in real life. They inspire you to try something new, try to do something different. Boys in the Boat, I mentioned that earlier. That is incredible film, not just talking about the sport of rowing, because I don't relate with rowing. I went sailing when I was a kid, but to see this group of young men who have no financial advantage whatsoever, pushing hard initially just so that they have a place to live and meals to eat, but pushing to the point where they're able to represent the United States in Berlin and win, overcoming their own difficulties, their own home life issues, all of those things. It's a kind of movie that really inspires you to realize that no matter what your current situation is, there is a possibility for you to move forward. Jesus Revolution, probably from last year. I didn't do a review on them. I am generally a little cautious of doing movie reviews from Christian movie companies, although we will be looking at Unsung Hero later this year, which is based on the life of Rebecca St. James and King and Country's, their family and their mother. We'll be taking a look at that later. But Jesus Revolution was incredibly inspiring and convicting, and also challenging, as you looked at how people during the 1960s, 1970s, when hippies were everywhere and the church just didn't know what to do with them, to watch that church open their doors to people who would normally not ever be in there, to be make a welcome space, to still preach the gospel, to still be true to what Scripture says, but then see exactly how that grew. And it was a fantastic film. It was challenging to make sure that I wasn't unintentionally not sharing the gospel with people that I need, and asking the question, what can we do to make people can hear the gospel? Uh, Great film, really well done. Kelsey Grammer plays one of the pastors. He does a fantastic job, and it's based on the true life of Greg Laurie and the true story of what happened with the Calvary movement. And one of the things I liked about that film is that everything didn't get tied up neatly in a neat little bow. You didn't end the movie where everybody is perfect, everything is great. It acknowledges that there are setbacks. It acknowledges that we're human and that there are going to be issues that come up with pride, especially when success. Dealing with pride is a huge issue. Uh, but it was worth watching, and I encourage you. I believe you can still stream it for free. I think I watched it on Netflix. I encourage you to go catch that. I missed it in theaters, but I was really glad I watched it once it was streaming. But why do all of these films, and I think that's really the question, is why are these films inspiring? Why do they cause us to change in ways that other films maybe not? Well, if we're looking at fiction as a genre, fiction films can really be inspiring, but the stories are all false. They're not real events. They're not real people. They're all made up. And so the storylines are contrived. They're crafted. So often things that are really unlikely could very neatly happen. Now, some of the best fiction stories don't have that problem. Many of them have storylines that are believable, but oftentimes you'll read a fiction story that may be entertaining, may be engaging, but there's ultimately an understanding that everything is happening just the way the author wants them to. They're often ending in a very nice and neat and with a happily ever after, and there's certainly a place for those, and those are engaging, but sometimes it just doesn't feel true. Because even the best storytellers are working from contrived events. They're working out of their imagination. And so those stories that are being told, while I'm a huge advocate for fiction, I love fiction stories, both historical fiction, contemporary fiction, and as we've seen before, science fiction. There is a certain element that we know that the author has control over every element so that things happen exactly the way they want. The message that the storyteller wants to tell is very clear, and everything from the way the characters behave, the way the events happen, even the setting is all up to the author. Nonfiction, or we'll call them true-ish stories that are based on real events, but not necessarily completely true. They're mostly real people and events. These are things that you can look up. You can see how did they happen, what was going on during the same time, what was the context of the events, if they change a time period for an event. I'm thinking of there are many films that do that. Uh, but it's based on real people, real things that have happened. We can look up and see what actually happened. I was watching a film last year called Argo, and I might have talked about it. Incredible story of how we got some people out of. I can't even remember the name of the city now that I'm talking about it, but got out of a place where they really couldn't get out of. Uh, Wonderful film, very memorable, even though ironically I can't remember core details, but I'm just going to chalk that up to the day. But great film, inspiring, really makes you think and be impressed with the spycraft that was displayed in that film. Great movie. But there's a whole list of films that you could watch that talk about those things that really happened. Um, the stories are tailored, but so they're not completely contrived. They may change some of the details, so the endings are mostly happy, but not entirely, because we know there's more to the story. Last year's Sound of Freedom, for instance, was inspiring not because it made us feel good, but because it made us realize there was a real problem in the world. And as you did research, as you looked, you realized that, well, yes, there's great things that happened from that film. There are also some negative things. One of the reasons why the organization that's behind Sound of Freedom has gotten some flack is because they'll say, well, yeah, they did some good, but they're actually causing some problems with real world law enforcement. There are some issues that are happening there. The stories aren't going to all be neatly wrapped up in the bow where all of the plot lines are tied up, because the reality is that in life, that's not true either. True events are often more relatable. They really sort of happen to real people. We may not necessarily always identify with the superhero, although good superhero stories do that, and we'll talk about that in a later episode. But when we look at kind of the everyman that happens in some of these movies, we realize that, this is someone that could be our neighbor. This could be someone who's next door to us. This is somebody who we might actually really know. This person is very much just like us. There's an understanding that these are real people, and there are events that happen that are similar to our own lives. And because of that, when we watch these films, we connect with the stories in ways that we don't otherwise do. We realize that, hey, this is something that could happen to me. This is something that could happen to my family, and to see them overcome those adversities, it's fantastic. I'm looking thinking of Gran Turismo as one of those films that happens where really worked hard, or Boys in the Boat, where you see them dealing with issues that all of us kind of deal with, especially with something like Boys in the Boat, where sometimes we're worried about finances, we're worried about where the next meal might come from. Maybe not actually, are we going to eat? But realizing that we don't have all the resources we wish we could, and to see that be successful, being somebody in ministry, looking at Jesus Revolution and seeing how that group of people worked and said, we need to open our doors, we need to have a greater impact with this group of people who need to hear the gospel. It's inspiring because we know this is a group of people that really did do this. And we can look at Greg Laurie even today and see the incredible ministry that he has now, and we can connect it all the way back to what happened back then. If you are a big fan of these kind of movies, and I have become one, I didn't used to be, but I have become one. I encourage you to check out a really great resource called History versus Hollywood. They take a look at movies that are out in theaters right now, or movies in the past, and they compare what has happened in the film based on what actually happened in real life. Coming up later this week, in fact, as soon as this video is done, I'm going to be recording my review of Arthur the King. I talked about this a couple weeks ago. And if you saw our review of Damsel last week, you do know that I had watched that instead of Arthur the King. Really enjoyed Arthur the King. It was, again, lots of feel good moments. We'll talk a little bit about why that is in the review that will be coming up in the next couple of days. Again, we're going to record it as soon as this is done. But going on History versus Hollywood lets you see, okay, what kind of things did they change? What things were uh, changed for historical accuracy, which are more into entertaining. So it's a good way of looking at the rest of the story. And you may end up finding more engagement by looking at these truly inspiring events by what actually happened as opposed to what Hollywood has said is happening. But it's still, still a lot of fun. I love movies. A lot of the reason that we're doing this channel is because I really do enjoy seeing movies, seeing really well done storytelling, and wanting to not just engage in the story just as a consumer, but actually talk about it. Talk about what worldviews are being highlighted. What issues do we need to address in our own lives based on what we've seen in these films? And so I encourage you, as you're looking at movies, especially movies that are on true life, as they are inspiring and good films, because they really sort of did happen. Look at them with open eyes to see what are they trying to tell you, why are they inspiring, and then enjoy them. Of course, sometimes we don't watch some films. Oppenheimer was one of those that I was really disappointed that I couldn't see, just because of the content choices they made. But again, I think that films are great. I think stories are great, and I love movies that are based on true events. And here are some of the reasons why. This week, I didn't have, I talk each week not only about our Bible reading and the topic of conversation, but I'll talk to you about what I'm playing and what I'm reading and watching. This week, I ended up watching a lot of videos about how to fix a computer. My computer, my laptop, completely died. And so I needed to figure out how to open the thing up, pull out hard drives and memory and all those kind of things, and then put it in a new one. And so a lot of my time was spent not doing what I had planned on. Not I had intended on recording the video for Arthur the King, for instance, on Wednesday, but now trying to figure out how to get things back up and running. We are back up and running, which is fantastic. There's also some of the videos I watched was about doing VR with the computer, because I do want to get back into that. I think that is a medium that really is the future of how people interact with technology and media, and I want to stay at least somewhere in the realm of understanding what's happening. But I've loved the IGN's April Fool's trailer for the Virtual Boy Pro. If you remember the Virtual Boy from some years ago, it gave everybody a headache. It was in red and black. You stuck your head into a thing on a stand, and it was very weird. I remember trying it once, and it's not something I want to repeat, but it was interesting. So that's what I've been up to. Haven't had a lot of time to do anything just for playing games, but lots of time watching videos on those. And then when I wasn't doing that, I was watching videos about planes and what it means to fly them, watching people take flights over bush country in Idaho. It was a lot. But Coming up in this next week, do look for our review on Arthur the King. I'm going to be recording it right after. Uh, Loved the movie. Definitely a great feel good film. One that's a lot of fun. We will talk about how it differs from the true story of the dog Arthur and the people who found him on that adventure racing. And you can see that probably in the next couple of days. Well, thank you for joining me again on this Friday morning. I really appreciate it. It means a lot that you're here. I hope that you have a fantastic week, that you'll are able to watch media, rest, do all of those kind of things. But thank you for joining me today for this, that, and Theology Live, and we will see you